Rest now, weary traveller. Another day is done, and you have journeyed well. Tonight I shall guide you into the realm of timeless Japanese literature, a world of profound beauty, where nostalgia breathes, shadows whisper, and dark, wondrous tales unfold. Leave the waking world behind and surrender to the tide of these words. Dim your screen, lower your volume, and let your eyes gently close. Step now into the beautiful dark of the story. "10 Nights Dreams" by Natsume Soseki. The first night I saw a dream like this. I was sitting by her bedside with my arms crossed, when the woman, lying flat on her back, spoke in a quiet voice. "I am about to die." Her long hair was spread over the pillow, framing her gentle oval face. Deep beneath her pure white cheeks, a warm flush of blood softly surfaced, and her lips were, of course, a vivid red. She looked nowhere near death, yet in a quiet but clear, distinct voice, she repeated, "I am about to die." I too felt with absolute certainty that she was indeed going to die. So leaning over, as if to peer closely into her face, I asked, "Is that so? Are you really dying now?" "Yes, I am dying," she replied, and snapped her eyes wide open. They were large, moist eyes, wrapped in long eyelashes, and inside it was simply a sea of solid, deep black. At the very depths of those pitch-black pupils, my own reflection floated with vivid clarity. Gazing at the lustrous sheen of her black eyes, which seemed to look through me infinitely deep, I thought to myself, can she really be dying, even with eyes like these? So, bringing my lips close to her pillow, I asked her tenderly once more, "You aren't really dying, are you? You'll be all right, won't you?" Then, keeping her dark eyes wide open, as if half asleep, she replied in that same quiet voice, "But I am dying. It cannot be helped." I asked her with total devotion, "Then can you see my face?" "Can I see it? Look, aren't you right there, reflected inside?" she said, and offered me a gentle smile. In silence, I pulled my face away from the pillow. Crossing my arms again, I couldn't help but wonder if she really, truly had to die. After a short while, the woman spoke once more. "When I am dead, please bury me. Dig a grave using a large mother-of-pearl shell. Then place a fragment of a fallen star as my tombstone. And please, wait beside my grave. I will come back to see you again." I asked her, "When will you come back to see me?" "The sun will rise, and then the sun will set. Then it will rise again, and set once more, while the red sun sinks from east to west, from east to west. Tell me, can you wait for me?" I nodded in silence. The woman raised her voice a pitch higher and said with absolute resolve, "Please wait for 100 years. Sit by my grave for 100 years and wait for me. I will surely come back to see you." I replied simply, "I will wait." Then my reflection, which had been so vivid in her dark pupils, began to blur and dissolve. Just as moving water ripples and distorts an image, it seemed to flow away, and her eyes snapped shut. A single tear rolled down her cheek from between her long eyelashes. She was already dead. I went down into the garden and began digging a hole with a mother-of-pearl shell. The shell was large with a smooth, sharp edge. Every time I scooped the earth, the moonlight caught the back of the shell and gleamed. There was also the heavy scent of damp earth. After a while, the hole was dug. I placed the woman inside. Then I gently covered her with the soft soil. Each time I threw it over her, the moonlight caught the back of the shell. Next, I went to gather a fragment of the fallen star and placed it lightly upon the earth. The star fragment was round. I thought it must have lost its sharp edges and become smooth during its long fall through the vast sky. As I lifted it and placed it on the soil, my chest and hands felt a little warm. I sat down upon the moss, thinking to myself that I would be waiting like this for the next 100 years. I crossed my arms and gazed at the round tombstone. Before long, just as the woman had said, the sun rose from the east. It was a large red sun. And just as she had said, it eventually sank into the west. It went straight down, remaining red. 1, I counted. After a while, a crimson sun crawled up once again, and then it silently set. 2, I counted again. As I went on counting 1, 2, in this manner, I lost track of how many red suns I had seen. No matter how much I counted, endless red suns passed over my head, beyond count. Yet the 100 years had not yet come. At last, gazing at the round, moss-grown stone, I began to wonder if the woman had deceived me. Suddenly, from beneath the stone, a green stalk grew out at an angle toward me. It grew longer before my eyes, stopping exactly at the height of my chest. At the top of the slender, swaying stalk, a long single bud, tilting its head slightly, plumply opened its petals. A pure white lily bloomed, fragrant enough to pierce through to my very bones, right before my nose. Then, from far above, a single drop of dew fell with a plop, and the flower swayed back and forth under its own weight. I leaned my head forward and kissed the white petals dripping with cold dew. As I pulled my face away from the lily, I inadvertently looked up at the distant sky, and a single morning star was twinkling there. The 100 years have already come. For the first time, I realized, the second night, I saw a dream like this. Leaving the Zen master's quarters, I walked along the corridor back to my own room, where the paper lantern was dimly lit. As I knelt with one knee on the cushion and flicked up the wick, a flower-like clump of soot dropped with a soft plop onto the vermilion stand. Instantly the room flashed bright. The paintings on the sliding doors were by Buisson. Black willows were drawn thick and thin, near and far, and a chilled-looking fisherman passed along the embankment with his straw hat tilted. In the alcove hung a scroll of Manjusri amid the waves. The scent of a half-burnt incense stick still drifted in the dark corner. Because it was a vast temple, it was dead silent, with no sign of any human presence. Looking up at the pitch-black ceiling, the round shadow cast by the lantern suddenly appeared as if it were alive. Keeping one knee raised, I lifted the cushion with my left hand and slid my right hand underneath. It was exactly where I expected it to be. Relieved by its presence, I smoothed the cushion back as it was and sat heavily upon it. You are a samurai. If you are a samurai, it should be impossible for you not to attain enlightenment, the master had said. Seeing how you failed to attain it after all this time, you must be no samurai at all. You are the dregs of humanity. Then he laughed. Aha, so you are angry then. If it vexes you, bring me proof of your enlightenment, he said, and abruptly turned his back on me. Unforgivable. Before the clock in the alcove of the adjacent great hall strikes the next hour, I will surely attain enlightenment. Once enlightened, I will enter his chambers again tonight. Then I will exchange the master's head for my enlightenment. If I do not attain it, I cannot take his life. I must attain it at all costs. I am a samurai. If I cannot attain enlightenment, I will commit ritual suicide. A samurai cannot live on after being humiliated. I will die a clean death. As these thoughts crossed my mind, my hand slipped beneath the cushion once again without thinking. I dragged out the dagger in its vermilion sheath. Gripping the hilt firmly, I flicked the red sheath away, and the cold blade flashed all at once in the dark room. It felt as if something terrifying was slipping away from my hands, gathering entirely at the tip, concentrating its murderous intent into a single point. Seeing this sharp blade cruelly shrunk to the size of a needle's head, coming to an inevitable point at the tip of its 9 inches and 5 minutes, I was suddenly seized by an intense urge to plunge it into myself. The blood of my body rushed toward my right wrist, making the hilt I gripped feel sticky. My lips trembled. I returned the dagger to its sheath, drew it close to my right flank, and then assumed the full lotus position. Joshu said, "Mu. What is Mu?" "Damn that priest," I gnashed my teeth. I clenched my back teeth so hard that hot breath hissed fiercely from my nose. My temples throbbed with pain. I snapped my eyes open twice their normal size. I could see the hanging scroll. I could see the lantern. I could see the tatami mats. The master's bald, kettle-like head appeared vividly before me. I could even hear his voice as he opened his crocodile-like mouth to mock me. What an unforgivable priest. I must take that kettle head. I will attain enlightenment. Mu, Mu, I chanted from the root of my tongue. Yet despite chanting Mu, the scent of the incense still drifted. What business does mere incense have here? I suddenly clenched my fist and struck my own head as hard as I could. I ground my back teeth together. Sweat poured from both my armpits. My back became rigid like a bar of iron. The joints of my knees suddenly ached with intense pain. What do I care if my knees break, I thought. Yet it was painful. It was agonizing. Mu would not easily appear. Just when I thought it was coming, the pain returned. I grew furious. I was filled with bitter resentment. It was intensely vexing. Tears began to fall, one after another. I wanted to fling my body against a massive boulder, crushing my bones and flesh to pieces. Even so, I endured and sat perfectly still. I bottled up an unbearable agony within my chest and bore it. That suffocating agony forced up the muscles throughout my body, struggling desperately to burst out from my pores. yet every single exit was sealed tight, leaving me in a state of utter, merciless torment. Before long, my mind began to warp. The lantern, Buson's painting, the tatami mats, the staggered shelves, they all seemed to exist yet not exist, to not exist yet exist. Even so, Mu did not manifest before me at all. I seemed to be merely sitting there in a daze. Right then, suddenly, the clock in the next room began to strike. Ding. My heart leaped. My right hand flew to the dagger at once. The clock struck its second note. Ding. The third night. I saw a dream like this. I was carrying a 6-year-old child on my back. He was, without a doubt, my own child. However, for some strange reason, his eyes had gone blind before I knew it, and his head was clean-shaven like a young monk's. When I asked him, "When did your eyes go blind?" he replied, "Why, since a long time ago, of course." His voice was unmistakably that of a child, but his choice of words was purely that of an adult. Furthermore, he spoke to me as an equal. On both sides of us lay green paddy fields. The path was narrow. From time to time, the silhouette of a heron flashed through the darkness. "We've reached the paddies, haven't we?" A voice spoke from my back. "How do you know?" I asked, turning my head slightly backward. "Because a heron is crying, isn't it?" he replied. And just as he said, a heron cried out twice. Though he was my own child, I began to feel a sudden chill of fear. If I kept carrying a thing like this on my back, there was no telling what would become of me. I looked ahead to see if there was some place where I could abandon him, and through the darkness, a massive forest appeared. The very moment I thought that the forest would be the perfect spot, a voice snickered from my back. "What are you laughing at?" The child gave no answer. Instead, he simply asked, "Father, am I heavy?" "You aren't heavy," I replied. "You'll see, I'll get heavy soon," he said. Keeping my eyes fixed on the forest as my target, I walked on in silence. The path through the paddies twisted and turned irregularly, making it incredibly hard to move forward as I wished. After a short while, the path split into two. Standing at the fork, I rested for a moment. "There should be a stone standing there," the boy said. Sure enough, a square stone marker, about 8 inches wide, stood about waist high. On its face it read, "Left to Hikakubo, right to Hotahara." Despite the pitch darkness, the red lettering was clearly visible. The red ink was the exact colour of a newt's belly. "The left would be better," the boy commanded. Looking to the left, I saw the forest from earlier, casting its dark shadow from the high sky right over our heads. I hesitated for a moment. "You don't need to hold back," the boy said again. Left with no choice, I began walking toward the forest. In my heart, I wondered how a blind child could possibly know everything. As I neared the single path leading into the woods, a voice spoke from my back. "Being blind is so inconvenient, isn't it? That's why I'm carrying you on my back, isn't it? So it's fine. I'm grateful to be carried, but I just can't stand being made a fool of by people. It's awful being made a fool of, even by one's own parent." A wave of revulsion washed over me. Wanting to get to the forest quickly, to abandon him and be done with it, I quickened my pace. "Just a little further, and you'll will understand. It was exactly a night like this, wasn't it? He said from my back, as if talking to himself. What was? I asked, my voice strained and on edge. What do you mean, what? You know exactly what. The child replied mockingly. Suddenly, I felt as though I did know. Yet, I couldn't understand it clearly. It just felt as though it had been exactly a night like this. And it felt as though if I went just a little further, I would understand completely. Understanding would be disastrous. I felt that I had to abandon him quickly before I understood, so I could find peace of mind. I quickened my steps even more. The rain had been falling for some time now. The path grew darker and darker. I was walking almost as if in a trance. The only reality was a small boy clinging to my back, shining like a mirror that reflected my past, present and future, without missing a single detail. And moreover, he was my own child. And he was blind. I could bear it no longer. Here it is, right at the root of that cedar tree. Through the rain, the boy's voice was crystal clear. I stopped in spite of myself. Without realizing it, I had entered the forest. The dark mass about 6 feet ahead of me was, just as the boy had said, unmistakably a cedar tree. Father, it was right at the root of that cedar tree, wasn't it? Yes, that's right, I answered before I could stop myself. It was the year of the dragon, the 5th year of the bunker era, wasn't it? Suddenly it felt precisely like the year of the dragon, the 5th year of the bunker era. It was exactly 100 years ago today that you murdered me. The moment I heard these words, a sudden blinding realization rushed into my head. On a pitch-black night just like this, 100 years ago, in the year of the dragon, the 5th year of the bunker era, I had murdered a blind man at the root of this very cedar tree. The instant I realized for the very first time I was a murderer, the child on my back suddenly became as heavy as a stone Buddhist statue. The 4th night, I saw a dream like this. In the middle of a spacious, earthen-floored room, a platform resembling a summer cooling bench was set up, with small low stools arranged around it. The platform gleamed with a deep black luster. In one corner, an old man sat alone before a square dining tray, drinking sake. His side dish appeared to be simmered vegetables. The old man had turned quite red from the effect of the alcohol. Moreover, his face was radiant and glossy, with no visible wrinkles to be found anywhere. Only his completely white full beard gave away the fact that he was an elderly man. Even as a child, I wondered just how old this man could be. Just then, a woman of the house, who had come back from the bamboo flume in the rear, after scooping water into a bucket, asked while wiping her hands on her apron, "How old are you, Grandpa?" The old man swallowed the simmered food stuffed in his cheek and replied nonchalantly, "I've forgotten how old I am." The woman tucked her wiped hands between her narrow sash and stood there, looking at the old man's face from the side. The old man took a hearty gulp of sake from a large bowl-like vessel, and then blew out a long, deep breath from amidst his white beard. At that, the woman asked, "Where is your home, Grandpa?" The old man cut his long breath short in the middle and said, "It's deep inside the navel." With her hands still thrust into her narrow sash, the woman asked again, "Where are you heading?" man took another hearty gulp of hot sake from that large bowl-like vessel, blew out a breath just like before, and said, "I'm heading over there." "Is it straight ahead?" the woman asked. Right then, the breath he had blown out travelled past the sliding paper doors, slipped beneath the willow tree, and blew straight out toward the dry riverbed. The old man stepped outside. I followed out after him. A small gourd dangled from the old man's waist. From his shoulder, a square box hung down beneath his armpit. He wore light blue leggings and a light blue sleeveless vest. Only his tabby socks were yellow. They looked somehow like tabby made of leather. The old man came straight beneath the willow tree. There were 3 or 4 children under the willow. Smiling, the old man drew a light blue hand towel from his waist. He twisted it tightly into a long, thin cord, like a paper string. Then he placed it right in the center of the bare ground. Next, he drew a large, round circle all around the towel. Finally, from inside the box hanging from his shoulder, he pulled out a brass pipe, the kind used by traditional candy sellers. "Soon that towel will turn into a snake, so keep watching, he said over and over. The children watched the towel intently. I watched it too. Keep watching. Are you ready?" the old man said as he began to blow the pipe, circling around and around the outer edge of the ring. I kept my eyes fixed solely on the towel, yet the towel did not move in the slightest. The old man blew the pipe, making a high piping sound. He went around the ring countless times. He moved on the tips of his straw sandals, taking stealthy steps, as if showing great deference to the towel. It looked somewhat terrifying, but it also seemed quite amusing. Before long, the old man stopped his piping abruptly. Then, opening the mouth of the box hanging from his shoulder, he nipped the towel by its head and pocked it right inside. "If you keep it like this, it turns into a snake inside the box. I'll show you soon, the old man said as he began to walk straight ahead. He passed beneath the willow tree and went straight down a narrow path. Wanting to see the snake, I followed him down the narrow path, wherever he went. The old man walked on, occasionally saying, "It's coming soon," or "It'll turn into a snake." At last he began to sing. "Soon it will be, a snake it will be, surely it will be," the pipe plays merrily. Singing this, he finally came out to the riverbank. Since there was neither a bridge nor a boat, I thought he would rest here and show us the snake inside the box. Instead, the old man began to wade splash, splash into the river. At first, the water was only about knee-deep, but gradually it rose from his waist to his chest, submerging him until he began to disappear. Even so, the old man went on walking straight ahead, wherever it led, while singing, "Deeper it grows, nighttime it shows, straight ahead it goes." And just like that, his beard, his face, his head, and his hood vanished completely from sight. Believing that the old man would show me the snake when he climbed up onto the opposite bank, I stood alone where the reeds rustled, waiting for him forever. But the old man, in the end, never came back up. The 5th night, I saw a dream like this. It was something from a very long time ago, a time that seemed close to the age of the gods. Having fought in a battle and unfortunately suffered defeat, I was captured alive and forced to kneel before the enemy general. The people of that era were all exceptionally tall, and they all grew long beards. They wore leather belts from which they hung swords that looked like iron bars. Their bows appeared to be nothing more than thick wisteria vines, used just as they were. They were neither lacquered nor polished. They were exceedingly primitive things. The enemy general gripped the very middle of his bow with his right hand, thrusting it down into the grass, and sat upon something that looked like an inverted sake jar. Looking at his face, his left and right eyebrows met thickly above his nose. In those days, of course, there were no such things as razors. Because I was a prisoner, it was out of the question for me to sit on a stool. I sat cross-legged upon the grass. On my feet I wore large straw boots. The straw boots of this era were deep. When standing, they reached all the way up to the kneecaps. At their edges, the straw was left slightly unhatched, hanging down like tassels that rustled and moved when one walked, serving as an ornament. The general looked at my face by the light of the bonfire and asked, "Will you die or will you live?" This was the custom of the time. Any prisoner of war would be asked this as a matter of course. To answer live meant to surrender, or to say die meant one would not submit. I answered with a single word: die. The general cast a bow he had been thrusting into the grass over to the side, and smoothly began to draw the bar-like sword hanging from his waist. The bonfire, swaying in the wind, flashed horizontally against the blade. I opened my right hand like a maple leaf, turned my palm toward the general, and raised it above my eyes. It was a signal to wait. The general returned the thick sword into its sheath with a sharp clank. Even in those days, love existed. I requested to see the woman I loved one last time before I died. The general said he would wait until dawn, until the rooster crowed. I had to summon the woman here before the rooster crowed. If the rooster crowed and the woman had not arrived, I would be killed without ever seeing her. The general remained seated, gazing at the bonfire. I waited for the woman on the grass. My large straw boots crossed. Night gradually deepened. From time to time, the bonfire would collapse with a rustling sound. Each time it crumbled, the flames would lurch toward the general as if in a panic. Beneath his pitch-black eyebrows, the general's eyes gleamed sharply. Then someone would come and throw a heap of fresh branches into the fire. A moment later, the fire would crackle and pop. It was a brave, spirited sound that seemed to strike back against the dark night. At that very moment, the woman led out a white horse that had been tied to an oak tree in the rear. Stroking its mane 3 times, she leapt lightly onto its high back. It was a bareback horse, with neither saddle nor stirrups. Kicking its broad belly with her long white legs, the horse dashed forward at full speed. Because someone had just replenished the bonfire, the distant sky appeared faintly bright. The horse flew through the darkness, aiming straight for this bright light. It flew toward it, exhaling 2 pillars of breath like columns of fire from its nostrils. Even so, the woman kicked the horse's belly incessantly with her slender legs. The horse flew so fast that the sound of its hooves echoed in mid-air. The woman's hair trailed like a streamer in the dark night. Yet she had still not reached the place where the bonfire burned. Then, from the side of the pitch-black road, suddenly, a rooster's voice rang out. "Cock-a-doodle-doo!" The woman threw her body backward and pulled back with all her might on the reins held in both hands. The horse drove the hooves of its forelegs down onto a hard rock with a sharp, violent clash. "Cock-a-doodle-doo!" the rooster crowed yet again. The woman let out a gasp and released the tightened reins all at once. The horse's knees collapsed. Together with its rider, it pitched straight forward and tumbled over. Beneath the rock lay a deep, treacherous abyss. The marks of those hooves remain carved upon the rock to this very day. The one who mimicked the crowing of the rooster was Amano-jaku, the perverse spirit. For as long as these hoofprints remain etched into the rock, Amano-jaku shall be my eternal enemy. The 6th night. I saw a dream like this. Word went around that Unkei was carving Neo statues at the main gate of Gokokuji Temple. Taking a stroll, I went to have a look and found that a large crowd had already gathered ahead of me, loudly exchanging their own backyard opinions. About 10 or 12 yards in front of the gate stood a massive red pine tree. Its trunk slanted over, partially hiding the roof tiles of the gate, and extended far up into the blue sky. The green of the pine and the vermilion lacquered gate reflected off each other beautifully. Furthermore, the position of the pine was perfect. It cut diagonally across the left edge of the gate without becoming an eyesore, widening as it reached higher until it projected past the roof, giving it a somehow antique feel. It looked as though it might date back to the Kamakura period. Yet the people watching were, like myself, entirely products of the Meiji era. Among them, rickshaw drivers were the most numerous. No doubt they were just standing around because they were bored, waiting for customers at the crossroads. "Boy, that's a huge thing, isn't it?" one said. "Making that must be a heck of a lot more trouble than making a real human being," said another. Then another man chimed in. Well, a Neo, eh? Do they still carve Neo statues these days?" "Well, I'll be. I always thought all the Neos were just ancient ones." "He sure looks powerful, doesn't he?" Another man struck up a conversation, with his kimono skirt tucked up and no hat on his head. He seemed to be quite an uneducated fellow. "You know what they say? Since the old days, they say there's nobody stronger than a Neo. They say he's even stronger than Yamato Takeru no Mikoto, for crying out loud." Completely indifferent to the commentary of the onlookers, Unkei kept his chisel and mallet moving. He did not look back even once. Perched high up, he was single-mindedly carving out the facial features of the Neo. Unkei wore a small eboshi-like cap on his head, and his large sleeves, whether from a suo robe or something else, were tied up across his back. His appearance was utterly archaic. He seemed completely out of place with the noisy, chattering spectators. I wondered to myself how on earth Unkei could still be alive in this day and age. Thinking what a strange thing it was, I nevertheless stood there and kept watching. Unkei, however, showed no sign of finding it either strange or peculiar, carving away with all his might. A young man who had been looking up at this attitude turned to me and said, "Spoken like a true Unkei. For him, we don't even exist. His attitude says that the only heroes in this world are the Neo and himself. Splendid." I found his words amusing. When I glanced slightly toward the young man, he immediately added, "Just look at the way he handles that chisel and mallet. He has reached a miraculous realm of absolute mastery." Unkei had had just carved out a thick eyebrow, an inch high horizontally. The instant he turned the edge of the chisel vertically, he struck down with his mallet from above at a slant, shaving through the hard wood at a single stroke. Thick wood chips flew off in sync with the sound of the mallet, and all at once the side of an angry nose with flared nostrils emerged. His method of putting in the blade was incredibly bold, and he seemed to harbour not the slightest shred of doubt. How can he use a chisel so carelessly and still manage to create exactly the eyebrows and nose he wants? I said, almost to myself, deeply impressed. Then the young man from before remarked, "Oh, it's not that he's creating the eyebrows and nose with the chisel. Those eyebrows and that nose are already buried inside the wood. He is merely digging them out with the power of the chisel and mallet. It's just like digging stones out of the earth, so there's absolutely no room for mistake." For the first time, I thought, so that is what sculpture is. And if that were the case, I realized that anyone could do it. Suddenly wanting to carve a Neo myself, I left the crowd and hurried straight home. I pulled a chisel and a metal hammer from my toolbox and went out back. There, stacked in abundance, were convenient logs of oak that had been felled by the recent storm, which I had intended to have the woodcutter saw into firewood. Choosing the largest log, I vigorously began to carve. But unfortunately, no Neo was to be found. With the next log, I again had the bad luck of failing to strike one. There was no Neo in the third log either. I went on carving the logs in the pile, one after another, but not a single one harboured a Neo within. At last, I attained enlightenment. In the wood of the Meiji era, no Neo is buried after all. And with that, I understood, more or less, the reason why Unki has lived to this very day. The seventh night, I was riding on a massive ship. Day and night, without a moment's pause, this ship spewed black smoke, cutting through the waves as it pressed forward. It made a tremendous roaring din, yet there was no telling where it was heading. From the bottom of the waves, the sun would rise like a glowing, red-hot iron poker. Just when I thought it had come directly over the tall mast and hung there for a while. Before I knew it, it would overtake the great ship, forge ahead, and finally sink back to the bottom of the waves with a hissing sizzle, just like hot iron. Each time it did, the blue waves in the far distance would boil up into a deep, madder red colour. Then the ship would chase after its wake with that tremendous roaring din. But it would never, ever catch up. One day, I caught hold of a crewman and tried asking him, "Is this ship heading west?" The crewman looked at me for a moment with a dubious expression, but before long he countered. "Why do you ask?" "Because it seems to be chasing after the setting sun." The crewman burst into a loud rolling laugh, and with that he walked away toward the other side. The setting sun to the west is its end in the east. Is that truly so? The rising sun from the east is its home in the west. Is that truly so? Our bodies upon the waves, our pillows upon the helm. Let it drift. Let it drift. They were chanting this refrain. When I walked over to the bow, I found a large group of sailors gathered together, hauling in a thick halyard. I became terribly forlorn. There was no telling when we would ever step onto dry land, and there was no knowing where we were being taken. The The only certainty was that we were spewing black smoke and cutting through the waves. That sea was immensely vast. It appeared boundlessly blue. At times it even turned purple. Yet only around the moving ship the water was always churning with pure white foam. I was so terribly forlorn. I began to think that I would rather cast myself into the sea and die than remain on a ship like this. There were many fellow passengers. Most of them appeared to be foreigners. However, they had all sorts of different faces. When the sky grew overcast and the ship rolled, a woman leaned against a railing, weeping bitterly. The handkerchief she used to wipe her eyes looked starkly white. Yet she wore a western dress, patterned like printed chintz. Looking at this woman, I realized that I was not the only one who was sorrowful. One evening, I went out onto the deck and was gazing at the stars alone when a foreigner approached and asked if I knew anything of astronomy. I was already thinking of dying out of sheer weariness. I had no need for things like astronomy. I remained silent. At that, the foreigner began to tell me about the 7 stars at the peak of Taurus. He said that the stars in the sea were all things created by God. Finally, he asked me if I believed in God. I looked up at the sky and stayed silent. Another time, when I stepped into the saloon, a young woman dressed in gay attire was facing away from me playing the piano. Beside her stood a tall, splendid-looking man, singing a song. His mouth looked extraordinarily large, yet the two of them seemed completely unconcerned with anything outside of themselves. They seemed to have forgotten that they were even on a ship. I grew more and more weary of it all. At last I resolved to die. And so, one evening, at a time when no one else was around, I steeled my heart and leapt into the midst of the sea. But the very instant my feet left the deck and my bond with the ship was severed, suddenly, life became precious to me. From the very bottom of my heart, I thought, I shouldn't have done this. But it was already too late. Whether I willed it or not, I had to plunge into the ocean. The ship seems to have been built extraordinarily high. Though my body had left the vessel, my feet did not easily reach the water. Yet, since there was nothing to catch hold of, I drew closer and closer to the water. No matter how much I pulled up my legs, it drew closer. The color of the water was pitch black. Meanwhile, the ship, spewing its usual black smoke, passed right on by. For the very first time, I attained the enlightenment that I would have been better off staying aboard, even on a ship with no known destination. Yet I was unable to make use of that realization. Harboring infinite regret and terror, I fell silently down toward the black waves. The 8th night. As I stepped over the threshold of the barber shop, 3 or 4 men huddled together in white clothes cried out in unison, "Welcome!" Standing in the center and looking around, I saw it was a square room. Windows opened on 2 sides, and mirrors hung on the remaining 2. When I counted the mirrors, there were 6 in total. I walked over to one of them and took a seat. As I did, the cushion gave a soft, sinking plop. It was an exceptionally comfortable chair to sit in. My face was reflected splendidly in the mirror. Behind my face, the window was visible. Furthermore, the counter grill could be seen at a slant. There was no one inside the grill. Outside the window, the upper bodies of people passing by on the bustling street were clearly visible. Shotaro passed by, accompanied by a woman. Before I knew it, Shotaro had bought and was wearing a Panama hat. As for the woman, there was no telling when he had managed to pick her up. I couldn't quite make her out. Both of them looked entirely triumphant. Just as I thought I would get a good look at the woman's face, they passed out of sight. A tofu vendor passed by, blowing his horn. Because he had the horn pressed to his lips, his cheeks were puffed out as if he had been stung by a bee. Since he passed out of sight, with his cheeks still puffed out like that, it left me terribly anxious. It felt as though he would be stung by a bee for the rest of his life. A geisha appeared. She had not yet put on her makeup. The base of her Shimada-style hair was loose, giving her head a somehow untidy look. Her face too looked half asleep, and her complexion was pitifully poor. She bowed and said, "I am terribly sorry for..." But her counterpart never did appear inside the mirror. Then a large man wearing white clothes came up behind me, and holding a pair of scissors and the comb, began to gaze at my head. I twirled my thin moustache and asked, "Well, do you think it will amount to anything?" The man in white said nothing, but lightly tapped my head with the amber-coloured comb he held in his hand. "Come now, my head is one thing, but what do you think? Will it amount to anything?" I asked the man in white. Still the man in white gave no answer, but simply began to snip his scissors merrily. I kept my eyes wide open, intending to watch every single reflection in the mirror. But each time the scissors snipped, black hair came flying toward me. So I grew frightened, and before long closed my eyes. Then the man in white spoke. "Sir, did you happen to see the goldfish vendor out front?" I said I hadn't. The man in white said nothing more, single-mindedly snipping his scissors. Suddenly someone shouted in a loud voice, "Watch out! It's dangerous!" Startled, I snapped my eyes open, and beneath the sleeve of the man in white, I saw the wheel of a bicycle. I saw the shafts of a rickshaw. Before I could even think, the man in white grabbed my head with both hands and forced it sharply to the side. The bicycle and the rickshaw vanished completely from sight. The sound of the scissors went on, snip, snip. Before long, the man in white moved to my side and began to trim around my ear. Since the hair was no longer flying toward the front, I opened my eyes with a sense of relief. "Millet mochi! Mochi, oh mochi!" a voice called out right nearby. He was deliberately striking a small wooden pestle against the mortar, keeping time as he pounded the mochi. Since I had only seen millet mochi vendors when I was a child, I wanted to catch a glimpse of him. However, the millet mochi vendor never appeared in the mirror. Only the sound of the mochi being pounded echoed. Straining my eyesight to the limit, I peered into the corner of the mirror. There, inside the counter grill, a woman was sitting before I knew it. She was a large-statured woman, with a darkish complexion and thick eyebrows. Her hair was tied in a ginkgo leaf style, and she wore a plain, unlined kimono with a black satin half collar. Resting on one knee, she was single-mindedly counting paper money. The bills appeared to be 10-yen notes. The woman cast down her long eyelashes, her thin lips sealed tight, intently reading the number of bills, and her counting was incredibly fast. Furthermore, no matter how far she went, there seemed to be no end to the number of bills. The pile resting on her lap was at most 100 sheets, yet no matter how long she counted them, those 100 sheets remained exactly 100 sheets. I stared blankly, fascinated by this woman's face and the 10-yen Suddenly, right by my ear, the man in white spoke in a loud voice. "Time for a wash, sir." Since it was a perfect opportunity, the very moment I stood up from the chair, I spun around to look toward the counter grill. But inside the grill there was no woman, no paper money, nothing to be seen at all. Paying my fee, I stepped outside. There, to the left side of the entrance, about 5 oval-shaped wooden tubs were lined up. Inside them a great many red goldfish, mottled goldfish, skinny goldfish and fat goldfish had been placed, and the goldfish vendor was standing right behind them. Resting his chin in his hands, the goldfish vendor remained perfectly still, staring intently at the goldfish lined up before him. He paid almost no heed to the activity of the bustling street. I stood there for a while, gazing at this goldfish vendor. But for as long as I stood watching, the goldfish vendor did not move in the slightest. The 9th night. The world, for some reason, had begun to grow restless. It looked as though a war might break out at any moment. It felt as if masterless horses, driven out by fire, were rampaging around the estate day and night, while foot soldiers chased after them day and night in a clamorous uproar. Yet inside the house, it was deathly silent and still. In the house lived a young mother and a 3-year-old child. The father had gone away. It was in the dead of a moonless night when the father left. Putting on his straw sandals right upon the tatami mat and donning a black hood, he departed through the kitchen door. At that moment, the light from the paper lantern the mother held cast a long, narrow beam into the dark night, illuminating an old cypress tree just before the hedge. The father never returned. Every day the mother would ask the 3-year-old child, "Where is your father?" At first the child said nothing, but after a while he began to answer, "Over there." Even when the mother asked, "When is he coming back?" he would still answer, "Over there," and laugh. At those times the mother would laugh too, and she taught him, repeating countless times the words, "He'll be back soon." However, the child only managed to learn the word soon. Sometimes when asked, "Where is your father?" he would answer, "Soon." When night fell and the surroundings fell quiet, the mother would retighten her sash, slide a shark-skin sheathed dagger between its folds, bind the child to her back with a narrow cloth cord, and softly slip out through the side gate. The mother always wore straw sandals. Listening to the sound of these sandals, the child would sometimes fall asleep upon her back. Walking west down the residential streets, lined with earthen walls, and ascending a long, gentle slope to the very bottom, there stood a massive ginkgo tree. Turning right with this ginkgo as a marker, a stone torii gate stood about 100 yards ahead. Reaching the torii gate by a path flanked on one side by paddy fields, and on the other entirely by dwarf bamboo, and passing beneath it, one entered a dark grove of cedar trees. Advancing along the flagstones for about 40 yards, one came out directly beneath the steps of an ancient shrine pavilion. Suspended over an offering box, washed to a dull grey, on the large bell rope. In the daytime, a plaque reading Hachi Mangu could be seen hanging beside the bell. The character for 8, Hachi, was written in an amusing style that resembled 2 pigeons facing each other. Whenever we passed beneath the torii gate, an owl would be hooting in the treetops of the cedars, and the sound of her straw sandals would go "Picha, picha," splashing faintly. When the sound stopped before the shrine pavilion, the mother would first ring the bell, then immediately crouch down and clap her hands. Usually at this exact moment, the owl would suddenly cease its hooting. Then the mother would pray for her husband's safety with single-minded devotion. In her heart, she believed firmly that since her husband was a samurai, if she made this desperate vow to Hachiman, the god of the bow and arrow, there was simply no reason her prayer would not be heard. The child would often wake up at the sound of this bell, and finding the surroundings pitch black, would suddenly burst into tears upon her back. At those times, the mother, while murmuring prayers under her breath, would gently sway her back to soothe him. Sometimes he would successfully stop crying. Other times he would wail even more fiercely. In either case, the mother would not easily stand up. Once she had finished praying for her husband's welfare in a general way, she would untie the narrow cord, slide the child from her back around to her front, and holding him in both arms, climb up into the shrine pavilion. "There's a good boy, wait here just for a little while," she would say, firmly pressing her cheek against the child's. Then, extending the narrow cord, she would bind the child and tie the other end to the railing of the pavilion. Stepping back down the stairs, she would pace back and forth along the 40 yards of flagstones, performing the Ohayakudo, the 100-fold prayer walk. The child, bound to the pavilion, would crawl around the wide veranda in the darkness, as far as the length of the cord allowed. On those nights, it was a relatively easy time for the mother. However, when the bound child wailed and whimpered, the mother would grow frantic. The pace of her 100-fold walk would become incredibly fast. She would grow terribly out of breath. When there was nothing else to be done, she would interrupt her walk, climb up into the pavilion, soothe him in various ways, and then begin the 100-fold walk all over again. While the mother was agonizing like this night after night, sleepless with worry, the father had in truth been murdered by masterless samurai a long, long time ago. This sorrowful tale is what I heard from the mother inside a dream. The 10th night. On the 7th night after Shotaro had been spirited away by a woman, he came wandering back unexpectedly. Ken-san came to let me know, saying that Shotaro had suddenly come down with a fierce fever and was collapsing in bed. Shotaro was the most handsome fellow in the neighborhood and an utterly good-natured, honest soul. He had only a single pastime. Donning his Panama hat, he would sit at the storefront of the fruit vendor in the evening, gazing at the faces of the women passing by on the street, and he would constantly be filled with admiration for them. Beyond that, he had no other notable characteristics to speak of. When not many women were passing by, he would look at the fruit instead of the street. There was all kinds of fruit. Peaches, apples, loquats and bananas were beautifully arranged in baskets, lined up in 2 rows so they could be taken immediately as gifts for the sick. Shotaro would look at these baskets and comment on how beautiful they were. He would say that if one were to go into business, there was nothing better than a fruit vendor. And yet, he himself did nothing but stroll around idly, wearing his Panama hat. At times, he would even pass judgment on the summer oranges, saying how wonderful their color was, However, never once did he actually shell out money to buy any fruit. Of course, he would never eat it for free either. He merely praised the color. One evening, a woman suddenly stood at the storefront. She appeared to be a person of high status, elegantly dressed. The color of her clothing caught Shotaro's fancy completely. On top of that, Shotaro was profoundly struck by the beauty of the woman's face. Thereupon, taking off his precious Panama hat, he offered her a polite greeting. The woman pointed to the largest of the basketed assortments and said, "Give me this one, please." Shotaro immediately picked up the basket and handed it to her. The woman held it by the handle for a moment and remarked on how terribly heavy it was. Being a man of leisure by nature and an exceedingly good-natured fellow to boot, Shotaro said, "Well then, let me carry it to your residence for you," and left the fruit shop together with the woman. From that moment on, he never came back. No matter how easygoing Shotaro might be, this was simply too carefree. Saying that it could be no ordinary matter, his relatives and friends began to make a great fuss when on the 7th night he came wandering back. Thereupon a crowd gathered around him, asking all at once, "Sho-san, where on earth have you been?" Shotaro replied that he had taken a tram and gone to the mountains. It must have been an extraordinarily long tram ride. According to what Shotaro said, the moment he stepped off the tram, he came right out onto a plain. It was an immensely vast plain, where nothing but green grass grew as far as the eye could see. As he walked over the grass together with the woman, they suddenly came out onto the very edge of a sheer cliff. At that moment the woman said to Shotaro, "Try leaping down from here." Peering over the edge, he could see the cliffside, but the bottom was invisible. Shotaro took off his Panama hat once more and repeatedly declined. Then the woman asked, "If you cannot bring yourself to leap, you will be licked by pigs. Will that suit you?" Shotaro absolutely loathed pigs and the singer Kumoemon. However, thinking that nothing could be traded for his life, he still hesitated to jump. Just then, a single pig came snorting up. Having no choice, Shotaro raised the slender beetle palm cane he was holding and struck the pig right on the snout. With a heavy grunt, the pig flipped over completely and fell down into the abyss. Just as Shotaro was catching his breath, another pig came up to rub its large snout against him. Left with no choice, Shotaro swung his cane up again. The pig grunted and tumbled headfirst into the depths of the hole. Then, yet another one appeared. At that moment, Shotaro suddenly noticed something and looked ahead. From the far edge where the green prairie met the sky, tens of thousands of countless pigs were forming a massive herd, charging in a straight line with snorting noses, aiming directly for Shotaro as he stood on the edge of the cliff. Shotaro was terrified from the bottom of his heart, but since there was no helping it, he carefully and politely struck the snout of each pig as it drew near, using his betel palm cane. Strangely enough, the very moment the cane touched his snout, the pig would flip over and fall to the bottom of the valley. Peering down, he could see a whole procession of upside-down pigs falling into the bottomless abyss. When he realized that he had knocked this many pigs into the valley, Shotaro grew terrified of his own deeds. But the pigs kept coming, wave after wave. They came with inexhaustible momentum, snorting their noses as if a black cloud had grown legs and was parting the green grass. Summoning a desperate courage, Shotaro struck the snouts of those pigs for 7 days and 6 nights. But at long last, his stamina and spirit were entirely depleted. His hands grew as weak and limp as konjac jelly, and in the end, he was licked by the pigs. And so he collapsed upon the edge of the cliff. Ken-san finished telling Shotaro's story up to this point and remarked, "So you see, it really isn't a good idea to stare at women too much." I thought he had a very good point. However, Ken-san added that he really wanted to have Shotaro's Panama hat. Shotaro will likely not survive. That Panama hat will surely belong to Ken-san. The tale is told. The curtain falls. Wrapped in the lingering echoes of this night, let yourself drift into a deep, serene, and boundless sleep. May the morrow bring you grace and peace. Until then, good night.